The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves across Riverside Community College as Sarah Mitchell adjusted the collar of her father's old Army field jacket. She didn't know that in 3 hours, this simple piece of clothing would ignite a confrontation that would shatter the carefully constructed anonymity she'd spent 4 years building. She didn't know that Officer Jake Thompson was already eyeing her from across the quad, his jaw tightening with every step she took. And she certainly didn't know that by sunset, the entire campus would discover why she always wore long sleeves, even in the Ohio heat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had perfected the art of being invisible. At 38, she moved through Riverside Community College like a shadow, arriving for her security shifts precisely on time, walking familiar routes with quiet efficiency, and speaking only when protocol demanded it. Her colleagues knew her as reliable but distant, the night shift security guard, who somehow managed to be everywhere she needed to be without anyone noticing how she got there. The field jacket she wore had belonged to her father, a Vietnam veteran, who'd passed away 6 years earlier. The olive drab fabric showed its age, with faded areas where patches had once been attached and a small tear near the left pocket that she'd never bothered to repair. To most people, it looked like any other military surplus jacket, the kind you could buy at any thrift store or Army-Navy outlet. What they couldn't see were the memories woven into every thread, the weight of decisions that had nothing to do with her father's service and everything to do with her own. Maria Santos, her partner on the day shift, had often wondered about Sarah's background. In the 4 years they'd worked together, she'd noticed things that didn't quite add up. Sarah knew building layouts instantly, even in areas she'd supposedly never worked. She could assess crowd dynamics with an accuracy that seemed impossible for someone whose only training was a weekend security certification course. When new guards struggled with report writing or emergency procedures, Sarah would quietly guide them through the process with a patience that suggested she'd done far more training than anyone realized. Tom Wilson, the head of campus security, had hired Sarah after a brief interview that left him with more questions than answers. Her references were solid but vague, her background check came back clean, and she demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to handle crisis situations. When he'd asked about her previous experience, she'd simply said she'd worked various security positions and left it at that. In 4 years, she'd never called in sick, never complained about overtime, and never caused him a moment's trouble. Sometimes the best employees were the ones who didn't need much explaining. The jacket, though, told a story Sarah wasn't ready to share. Under the right light, you could see the outline where a name tape had once been sewn. If you looked closely at the sleeve, you might notice the way the fabric seemed slightly thicker in one spot, as if something had been removed and the area carefully mended. But Sarah was careful never to let anyone look that closely. She kept her sleeves rolled down, her past locked away, and her true self hidden beneath layers of deliberate ordinariness. Riverside Community College sprawled across 43 acres of what had once been farmland in Millfield, Ohio. The campus served a diverse population of traditional students, working adults returning to school, and veterans using their GI Bill benefits to start new careers. Sarah had chosen to work there partly because of the anonymity it offered. Unlike the nearby university with its scrutinizing administration and rigid protocols, the community college operated with a more relaxed atmosphere where someone could blend into the background without drawing unwanted attention. Her daily routine was precisely choreographed to avoid crowds and minimize interactions. She arrived each morning at 7:30, 30 minutes before her shift officially began, and spent that time walking the perimeter of the campus. She told herself it was about familiarizing herself with potential security issues, but the truth was more complicated. The walking helped quiet the restlessness that still visited her some mornings, The feeling that she should be somewhere else, doing something more important than checking locks and monitoring parking lots. During her rounds, Sarah noticed everything. She could tell you which professors habitually left their office windows unlocked, which students regularly parked in unauthorized areas, and which maintenance staff took longer breaks than they were supposed to. She observed patterns and inconsistencies with the kind of attention to detail that most people reserve for things they were passionate about. But Sarah wasn't passionate about campus security. She was simply very good at staying alert, a skill that had once meant the difference between life and death, and now helped her excel at a job that barely challenged her abilities. The student center was always busy during lunch hours, filled with young people who reminded Sarah of soldiers she'd once known. Their energy and optimism sometimes made her smile, though she was careful not to let anyone see it. She'd position herself near the windows where she could observe the main quad, while staying close enough to respond to any incidents inside the building. It was from this vantage point that she first noticed Officer Jake Thompson watching her. Jake Thompson was 26 years old and had been working campus police for 8 months. He'd applied to the police academy twice and been rejected both times, a fact that left him with a chip on his shoulder about authority and respect. He compensated for his insecurities by being overly aggressive about enforcing minor regulations and inserting himself into situations that didn't require police intervention. The campus security guards generally tried to avoid him, knowing that any interaction would likely escalate into a lecture about proper procedures or jurisdictional boundaries. Thompson had noticed Sarah's jacket weeks ago, and it bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He'd never served in the military himself, despite telling people he'd considered it. But he'd grown up in a military family and considered himself an expert on military protocols and traditions. The sight of someone wearing what appeared to be military clothing, without proper identification or authorization, struck him as disrespectful, possibly even illegal. He'd been waiting for the right moment to address the issue, preferably in front of witnesses who could appreciate his dedication to upholding military honor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Veterans Day ceremony and career fair provided the perfect opportunity. The annual event brought together local veterans, active duty military personnel, and community members to honor those who'd served while connecting veterans with employment and educational opportunities. The college's ROTC program would present colors, local veterans organizations would set up information booths, and Dean Robert Hayes would deliver his traditional address about service and sacrifice. For Thompson, it represented a chance to demonstrate his respect for military traditions by addressing what he saw as a clear violation of military protocol. Sarah had volunteered for extra security coverage during the event, just as she did every year. Large crowds made her uncomfortable, but she'd learned to manage the anxiety by staying busy and maintaining her professional focus. She told herself she was just doing her job, but there was more to it than that. Being around veterans, even in a peripheral role, felt like a connection to something she'd lost, a way of serving that didn't require her to explain herself or relive experiences she preferred to keep buried. The morning of Veterans Day dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of autumn weather that made Ohio beautiful despite its reputation for gray skies and harsh winters. Sarah arrived at her usual time, but instead of her normal perimeter walk, she helped the facilities crew set up tables and chairs in the main quad. She worked with quiet efficiency, anticipating needs and solving problems before anyone else noticed them. Her movements were economical and purposeful, the kind of efficiency that comes from training rather than experience. Professor Linda Carter, who taught military history and had served as a Navy officer before transitioning to academia, observed Sarah from across the quad as she worked. There was something about the way Sarah carried herself that caught her attention. The bearing was too precise for civilian training, the situational awareness too acute for someone who'd never served in a combat zone. Carter had seen enough veterans transition to civilian careers to recognize the signs, but something about Sarah seemed different. Most veterans who struggled with civilian life either advertised their service proudly or struggled to hide it convincingly. Sarah seemed to have found a middle ground that suggested both pride and pain in equal measure. As the morning progressed, vendors and veterans organizations began arriving to set up their displays. The quad filled with tables covered in brochures about educational benefits, job training programs, and support services for veterans. Representatives from local businesses mingled with students and faculty, everyone preparing for the ceremony. That would begin at noon. Sarah coordinated security coverage with the campus police, ensuring that all entry points were monitored and emergency procedures were clear. She worked professionally with Thompson, though she noticed his tendency to position himself where he could observe her while she worked. The jacket became more noticeable as the crowd grew. Among the mixture of civilian clothes and formal military uniforms, Sarah's field jacket stood out as something that didn't quite fit either category. It wasn't crisp enough to be an active-duty uniform, but it was too authentic to be casual. Military-inspired fashion. Thompson found himself watching her more closely, trying to determine exactly what bothered him about her appearance. When she bent down to help an elderly veteran navigate the uneven walkway, he noticed how she moved with precision and care, like someone accustomed to being responsible for others' safety. Dean Robert Hayes arrived at 11:30, resplendent, in his dress uniform for the ceremony. At 55, he cut an impressive figure, his bearing still sharp despite his retirement from active duty 5 years earlier. Hayes had served 28 years in the Army, including tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, before accepting the position at Riverside Community College. He believed deeply in the institution's mission of providing educational opportunities for veterans and had worked tirelessly to expand support services for student veterans. His presence at the Veterans Day ceremony wasn't just ceremonial, it was personal. Sarah watched from her position near the student center as Hayes greeted various attendees. She recognized his bearing immediately, the way he carried himself, with authority tempered by genuine warmth. She'd served under officers like him, commanders who understood that leadership meant taking care of the people under your command. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself, to have a mission that mattered and brothers and sisters who would stand beside her no matter what. Then she caught Thompson staring at her again and forced herself back to the present. The ROTC cadets arrived in formation, their uniforms immaculate and their movements synchronized. Alex Rodriguez, a sophomore who served as the unit's color guard commander, led the group through their final practice before the ceremony. Sarah found herself watching them with a mixture of pride and concern. They were so young, so eager to prove themselves, so certain that their training had prepared them for whatever challenges lay ahead. She remembered being their age, remembered the confidence that came from believing you were invincible and the shock of discovering you weren't. As noon approached, the crowd began gathering around the small stage that had been erected near the campus memorial garden. The memorial itself was modest, a simple granite marker listing the names of local veterans who died in service, surrounded by a small garden that the groundskeeping staff maintained with particular care. Sarah positioned herself at the edge of the crowd where she could observe both the ceremony and the surrounding area. Her radio crackled occasionally with routine communications from other security personnel, but the event was proceeding smoothly. Thompson had positioned himself closer to the stage, ostensibly to provide security support, but actually to be visible to the assembled crowd. He'd changed into his most formal uniform and polished his badge until it gleamed in the autumn sunlight. This was his moment to demonstrate his respect for military service and his dedication to maintaining proper standards. When he spotted Sarah standing at the back of the crowd, Still wearing that unauthorized jacket, he felt his jaw tighten with determination. After the ceremony, he would address the situation properly and publicly. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors by the ROTC unit. Alex Rodriguez and 3 other cadets marched with military precision, their movements sharp and confident as they posted the American flag and the college banner. The crowd stood at attention, hands over hearts, as a student vocalist sang the national anthem. Sarah stood quietly at the back, her hand raised like everyone else's, but her eyes distant with memories that the music always triggered. Dean Hayes approached the podium with measured steps, his speech notes forgotten as he looked out at the assembled crowd. He'd given this address many times, but each year it felt more personal, more important. The faces in the crowd represented not just the college community, but the broader American commitment to those who'd served. He began by acknowledging the sacrifice of those who died in service, reading the names from the memorial marker with careful reverence. Then he turned to the living veterans in the crowd, acknowledging their service and the challenges many faced in transitioning to civilian life. As Hayes spoke about the importance of supporting veterans in their educational and career goals, Sarah found herself thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. 4 years ago, she'd been drifting between temporary jobs, struggling with nightmares and survivor's guilt, unable to find a place where she belonged. The security position at Riverside had offered stability and anonymity, a chance to serve in a small way without having to explain herself or relive experiences she preferred to forget. She'd built a life of quiet service, helping where she could, while staying invisible enough to avoid questions she wasn't ready to answer. Thompson had been listening to the speech with growing impatience. All this talk about supporting veterans was exactly why it was important to maintain proper standards and respect for military traditions. Someone wearing unauthorized military clothing at a Veterans Day ceremony was particularly offensive, a slap in the face to everyone who'd earned the right to wear the uniform. As Hayes concluded his remarks and the crowd began to applaud, Thompson made his decision. It was time to address the situation properly and publicly. The ceremony concluded with the retiring of colors and a moment of silent reflection. As the crowd began to disperse and move toward the career fair booths, Thompson began making his way through the crowd toward Sarah. She was helping an elderly veteran find the table for disability services when she noticed him approaching with obvious purpose. Something in his expression and bearing told her this wasn't going to be a routine interaction about security procedures. Maria Santos was nearby, talking with a representative from a local manufacturing company about their veteran hiring programs. When she noticed Thompson's approach toward Sarah, she'd worked with both of them long enough to sense when a situation was about to escalate, and Thompson's body language suggested he was preparing for a confrontation rather than a conversation. She began moving in their direction, hoping to diffuse whatever was about to happen before it disrupted the positive atmosphere of the Veterans Day event. Professor Carter was packing up her materials from the military history department's information table when she noticed the developing situation. She'd been watching Sarah throughout the morning, trying to place what seemed familiar about her bearing and presence. Now seeing Thompson approach with obvious aggressive intent, she felt a growing concern that someone was about to make a serious mistake. There was something about Sarah that suggested she'd earned whatever respect Thompson was about to challenge, but the younger man's determination was obvious even from a distance. Alex Rodriguez and the other ROTC cadets were securing their equipment when Rodriguez noticed the tension developing near the memorial garden. As the unit's senior cadet, he'd been trained to recognize and de-escalate conflicts, but something about this situation felt different. The woman in the field jacket stood with a stillness that reminded him of his drill instructors, while the campus police officer approached with the kind of aggressive confidence that Rodriguez had learned usually preceded someone making a fool of themselves. Sarah finished helping the elderly veteran and turned to face Thompson as he reached her position. She could see the determination in his eyes and the way he'd positioned himself to be visible to as many people as possible. This wasn't going to be a quiet conversation about uniform regulations. This was going to be a public confrontation designed to make a point about military respect and proper authority. She straightened slightly, falling into an unconscious position of attention that she hadn't used in years, and waited for him to make his accusation. The mystery surrounding Sarah Mitchell had deepened with each passing month at Riverside Community College. Her supervisor, Tom Wilson, had noticed patterns that defied explanation for someone with basic security training. When the computer system crashed during registration week, Sarah had somehow maintained perfect situational awareness across the entire campus, using only handheld radios and a coordination system she'd improvised on the spot. When a violent thunderstorm knocked out power to half the buildings, she'd guided emergency responders through the complex with the precision of someone who'd memorized every corridor, stairwell, and emergency exit. Maria Santos had worked alongside Sarah for long enough to recognize that her partner's knowledge extended far beyond civilian security protocols. During a medical emergency in the student center, Sarah had provided first aid with a competency that suggested advanced training. Her assessment of the situation had been immediate and accurate, her instructions to bystanders clear and authoritative, and her coordination with paramedics seamless. When Maria asked later where she'd learned medical procedures, Sarah had simply mentioned taking the first aid course years earlier and changed the subject. The field jacket Sarah wore carried significance that went beyond sentimental attachment to her father's service. Tom Wilson had served briefly in the National Guard and recognized authentic military issue when he saw it. The fabric quality, the construction details, and the way certain areas showed wear patterns suggested extensive field use rather than casual civilian wear. More puzzling were the faint outlines where patches had clearly been removed with surgical precision, leaving only slight discoloration in the fabric to hint at what had once been displayed there. Professor Carter had continued observing Sarah throughout the semester, her curiosity growing with each interaction. During a campus safety meeting, Sarah had presented a security assessment that demonstrated understanding of tactical principles, far beyond civilian applications. Her recommendations for improving campus security included considerations for multiple scenarios and contingency planning that suggested military-level strategic thinking. When Carter mentioned that her analysis reminded her of security briefings she'd received during her Navy service, Sarah had simply nodded politely and offered no elaboration. The college's location in Millfield, Ohio, provided an ideal environment for someone seeking anonymity while remaining connected to military culture. The surrounding community included several veterans organizations, a National Guard armory, and enough former service members that military bearing and knowledge didn't automatically draw attention. Sarah could blend into this environment while maintaining the kind of low profile that suggested she had reasons for avoiding scrutiny beyond simple introversion. Alex Rodriguez had noticed Sarah during ROTC training exercises on campus. While she maintained professional distance as security personnel, her positioning and movement patterns suggested she was evaluating their performance with the eye of someone who understood military operations. When his unit practiced emergency response drills, Sarah's coordination with campus security was so smooth it appeared choreographed. Yet Rodriguez knew they'd never trained together. Her ability to anticipate their needs and provide support without interfering suggested experience with military operations that went far beyond basic security work. The Veterans Day ceremony had drawn Sarah into closer proximity with military personnel and veterans than she typically allowed. Dean Hayes had observed her throughout the morning setup, noting how she'd positioned herself to maintain visual contact with all approaches to the ceremony area while staying close enough to respond quickly to any incidents. Her situational awareness was exceptional, but more telling was the way she'd unconsciously adopted military bearing when interacting with the ROTC cadets and visiting veterans. Thompson's growing fixation on Sarah's jacket reflected his own insecurities about military service and his desperate need to demonstrate authority and knowledge about military protocols. He'd researched uniform regulations extensively, memorizing rules and procedures with the dedication of someone trying to compensate for never having served. His interpretation of military dress codes was rigid and literal, lacking the nuanced understanding that comes from actual experience with military culture and traditions. The jacket itself held secrets that extended far beyond its obvious military origins. Hidden in the inner pocket was a small piece of paper with GPS coordinates written in Sarah's precise handwriting, marking a location in Afghanistan that she visited in her nightmares but had never discussed with anyone. The left sleeve bore a small stain near the cuff that looked like rust, but was actually blood that had never completely washed out. The zipper pull had been replaced with one from a different manufacturer, a field repair that had become necessary after the original was damaged in circumstances she preferred not to remember. Sarah's apartment near campus reflected the same careful anonymity she maintained at work. The furnishings were minimal and functional, chosen for practicality rather than comfort or style. Her bedroom closet contained exactly enough clothing for her work and personal needs, with nothing that would indicate military service to a casual observer. Hidden in a locked box under her bed were items she couldn't bring herself to display, but couldn't bring herself to discard. Photographs, letters, and official documents that told the story of a life she'd left behind. The ROTC program at Riverside Community College served as a pipeline for students transitioning from military service to civilian careers, as well as those preparing for military service. Alex Rodriguez represented the latter category, a serious young man who approached his military training with the intensity of someone who understood that his education was preparing him for real responsibilities. His respect for military traditions was genuine and informed, unlike Thompson's performative displays of military knowledge. Professor Carter's military background provided her with insight into the challenges veterans faced when transitioning to civilian careers. She'd observed enough former service members to recognize the signs of someone carrying invisible wounds, and Sarah's behavior suggested trauma that went beyond normal adjustment difficulties. The combination of exceptional competence and deliberate invisibility often indicated someone who'd experienced combat in ways that had left lasting psychological scars. Tom Wilson had gradually developed trust in Sarah's judgment to the point where he rarely questioned her recommendations about security matters. Her instincts about potential problems were consistently accurate, and her ability to de-escalate tense situations was remarkable. She'd handled drunk students, angry parents, and facility emergencies with the kind of calm competence that suggested extensive experience managing crises. Yet she deflected any attempts to learn about her background with polite but firm redirection. Maria Santos had developed genuine affection for Sarah despite her partner's emotional distance. Working security together required trust and communication, and Sarah had proven herself reliable in every situation they'd encountered. Her dry sense of humor emerged occasionally during quiet moments, and her protective instincts toward students and staff were obvious even when she tried to maintain professional detachment. Maria suspected that Sarah's reserve stemmed from painful experiences rather than natural introversion. The Veterans Day ceremony represented a convergence of elements that would make Sarah's continued anonymity impossible to maintain. The presence of active-duty military personnel, veterans from multiple service branches, and ROTC cadets created an environment where military knowledge and bearing would be noticed and evaluated by people qualified to recognize authentic service. Thompson's determination to confront what he perceived as unauthorized uniform wear would force a public reckoning that Sarah had spent 4 years avoiding. Dean Hayes had served long enough to recognize the difference between someone who'd worn a uniform, and someone who'd earned the right to wear it with pride. His observations of Sarah throughout the morning had convinced him that her military bearing was authentic, but something about her deliberate anonymity suggested a story more complex than simple preference for privacy. His experience with combat veterans had taught him that the most capable people were often the most reluctant to discuss their service. The crowd gathering for the Veterans Day ceremony included representatives from multiple generations of military service, from Vietnam veterans like Dean Hayes to recent returnees from Iraq and Afghanistan. This mixture of experience levels and service branches created an environment where military knowledge, bearing, and traditions would be evaluated by people with first-hand experience rather than academic understanding. Sarah's position at the edge of this gathering made her both visible and vulnerable to scrutiny she'd previously avoided. Thompson's approach towards Sarah carried the confidence of someone who believed he was about to vindicate his authority and demonstrate his knowledge of military protocols. His research into uniform regulations had convinced him that civilians wearing military clothing without proper authorization were committing a serious breach of military tradition. His intention to address this violation publicly reflected his desire to be recognized as someone who understood and respected military standards, even though he'd never served. Sarah's recognition that confrontation was inevitable triggered responses that she'd spent years suppressing. Her bearing straightened almost imperceptibly. Her hands assumed positions that suggested readiness for conflict, and her awareness expanded to include not just Thompson, but every person within range who might become involved in whatever was about to unfold. These reactions were automatic, trained responses that emerged despite her conscious efforts to maintain civilian demeanor. The positioning of other key figures around the ceremony area created a stage for the developing confrontation. Professor Carter had moved closer, sensing trouble and hoping to intervene if necessary. Alex Rodriguez and his fellow ROTC cadets were watching with professional interest, recognizing the signs of approaching conflict. Maria Santos was approaching from another direction, motivated by protective instincts toward her partner. Dean Hayes remained near the podium, but his attention had shifted from post-ceremony conversations to the tension developing near the memorial garden. Thompson's determination to make his challenge public reflected his belief that military traditions required public defense and that his intervention would be appreciated by the veterans and active duty personnel present. His understanding of military protocol was extensive but theoretical, lacking the practical experience that would have warned him about making assumptions based on appearances. His confidence in his position was absolute, reinforced by months of observing what he interpreted as unauthorized military dress. Sarah's preparation for the coming confrontation involved psychological readiness she hadn't needed to access in years. The skills that had once kept her alive in combat zones weren't directly applicable to civilian conflicts, but the mental discipline and emotional control remained available when needed. Her ability to assess threats, evaluate options, and maintain composure under pressure had been honed by experiences far more dangerous than anything Thompson could present. The atmosphere around the memorial garden had shifted subtly as more people became aware of the developing tension between Thompson and Sarah. Conversations quieted, attention focused, and positioning adjusted as observers unconsciously prepared to witness whatever was about to unfold. The Veterans Day ceremony had concluded peacefully, but the aftermath was about to become far more memorable than the official program. Professor Carter's position allowed her to observe both Thompson's determined approach and Sarah's subtle preparation for confrontation. Her military experience had taught her to recognize the difference between someone posturing for effect and someone preparing for actual conflict. Thompson's body language suggested aggressive confidence, while Sarah's stillness indicated readiness born from experience with genuine threats. Alex Rodriguez found himself caught between respect for Thompson's authority as a law enforcement officer and growing, concerned that the campus police officer was about to make a serious mistake. His military training had emphasized the importance of gathering complete information before taking action, and something about the woman in the field jacket suggested there was more to her story than Thompson had considered. Maria Santos's approach was motivated by protective instincts that had developed over 4 years of working with Sarah. She'd seen her partner handle difficult situations with remarkable skill and composure, and she knew that Sarah's emotional control was exceptional. If Sarah was preparing for confrontation rather than trying to avoid it, the situation was more serious than Thompson realized. The jacket that had triggered Thompson's attention represented layers of meaning that extended far beyond its obvious military origins. Sarah's father had served with distinction in Vietnam, earning decorations for valor that had never been displayed in their family home. Her decision to wear his jacket wasn't about military fashion or sentimental nostalgia, but about maintaining a connection to military service that honored both his legacy and her own, while avoiding questions she wasn't ready to answer. Thompson halted directly in front of Sarah, his position calculated to draw maximum attention from the surrounding crowd. His voice carried the authority he'd been taught to project, amplified by his determination to address what he perceived as a serious violation of military protocol. The opening words of his challenge would transform a peaceful Veterans Day ceremony into a confrontation that would reveal truths that had been hidden for years. Sarah's response to Thompson's positioning was subtle but significant. Her stance shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight distribution adjusted for stability, and her hands assumed positions that suggested readiness without appearing threatening. These adjustments were automatic responses trained into her through experiences where quick reactions meant survival, but in the civilian context of a college campus, they were simply signs of exceptional awareness and preparation. The crowd's attention had focused completely on the developing confrontation between Thompson and Sarah. Veterans, students, faculty, and community members found themselves witnesses to a scene that had begun as a peaceful ceremony honoring military service but was about to become something far more complex and revealing. The stage was set for revelations that would challenge assumptions, expose hidden truths, and force everyone present to reconsider what they thought they knew about service, sacrifice, and the people who carry invisible burdens. Thompson's opening challenge would be delivered with absolute confidence in his position and complete ignorance of the storm he was about to unleash. His determination to uphold military traditions was genuine, but his understanding of those traditions was incomplete. The woman he was about to confront had earned rights he'd never dreamed of claiming, and the proof of her service was written in scars and memories that would soon be revealed to everyone present. The moment of confrontation had arrived, carrying with it the weight of misunderstanding, hidden truth, and the complex relationship between military service and civilian life. Thompson stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed he was defending military honor, while Sarah prepared to face questions she'd spent 4 years avoiding. The Veterans Day ceremony was about to become the setting for revelations that would change everything. Thompson's voice cut through the conversations around them with practiced authority. "Excuse me, ma'am, I need to speak with you about that jacket." His tone carried the official weight of law enforcement combined with the moral certainty of someone convinced he was defending important principles. The surrounding conversation stopped as people turned to observe the interaction, creating an audience for what Thompson intended to be a public lesson about military respect and proper protocol. Sarah turned to face Thompson fully, her expression neutral but alert. She'd anticipated this moment for months, recognizing his growing attention to her appearance and bearing. Her response was calm and professional, reflecting both her security, training, and military discipline that ran much deeper. "Is there a problem, Officer Thompson?" Her voice carried no defensiveness or anger, only the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with challenges to her authority. That jacket you're wearing appears to be military issue. Thompson continued, his voice rising slightly to ensure nearby witnesses could hear his words clearly. I need to see some form of military identification or documentation that authorizes you to wear it. His demand was delivered with the certainty of someone who'd researched the relevant regulations and believed he was operating well within his authority as a law enforcement officer. The crowd around them had grown larger as people sensed conflict developing. Maria Santos pushed through the gathering observers, her concern for Sarah overriding her usual reluctance to involve herself in confrontational situations. Professor Carter moved closer from another direction, her military experience telling her that this confrontation was based on incomplete information that could lead to serious embarrassment for the campus police officer. Alex Rodriguez and several other ROTC cadets had positioned themselves where they could observe the interaction clearly. Their military training had taught them to study conflicts for lessons about leadership, authority, and decision-making under pressure. Rodriguez found himself analyzing both Thompson's approach and the woman's response, noting details that suggested this situation was more complex than it appeared. Dean Hayes had become aware of the confrontation and was moving in their direction, his concern growing as he observed Thompson's aggressive posture and the woman's controlled stillness. His experience with military personnel and veterans had taught him to recognize the signs of someone who'd served in combat, and Sarah's bearing suggested experience that went far beyond civilian security work. I'm not currently active duty, Sarah replied calmly, her hands remaining relaxed at her sides, despite the growing tension in Thompson's voice and posture. I work security for the college, and I'm authorized to be here in that capacity. Her response was factually accurate but deliberately incomplete, offering the minimum information necessary to address his immediate question without revealing details she preferred to keep private. Thompson's confidence increased with what he interpreted as evasiveness on Sarah's part. That's exactly my point, ma'am. If you're not currently serving, you're not authorized to wear military clothing. This appears to be a clear case of stolen valor, and I have a duty to address it properly. His accusation carried the weight of federal law, since stolen valor was indeed a crime when it involved fraudulent claims about military service for personal gain. The accusation of stolen valor sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. Veterans and military family members understood the serious nature of such claims, while civilians recognized the gravity in Thompson's tone and the reactions of those around them. Sarah's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in her eyes that suggested the accusation had struck deeper than Thompson realized. Maria Santos reached the edge of the crowd and began pushing through towards Sarah, her protective instincts overriding her natural tendency to avoid confrontational situations. She'd worked with Sarah long enough to know that her partner didn't seek attention or make claims about background she couldn't support. If Sarah was wearing military clothing, there had to be a legitimate reason that Thompson was too inexperienced to recognize. Professor Carter's military experience had taught her to recognize authentic service members regardless of their current status or appearance. Sarah's bearing, situational awareness, and response to challenge all suggested genuine military background. Carter began moving more urgently toward the confrontation, hoping to prevent Thompson from making a serious mistake that would embarrass both himself and the college. Officer Thompson, Sarah said quietly, her voice remaining steady despite the serious nature of his accusation. I think you should consider gathering more information before making allegations about stolen valor. That's a serious charge that shouldn't be made lightly. Her warning was delivered without anger or defensiveness, simply as factual advice from someone who understood the implications of his words better than he did. Thompson interpreted her response as confirmation of his suspicions rather than the warning it was intended to be. Ma'am, the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate authorization to wear that uniform. If you can't provide military identification or documentation, I'm going to have to ask you to remove the jacket and accompany me for further questioning." His demand escalated the confrontation significantly, transforming what had begun as a question about uniform regulations into a potential arrest situation. The crowd's reaction intensified as Thompson's demands became more aggressive. Veterans in the audience exchanged concerned glances, while students and faculty members found themselves witnessing a confrontation that was clearly more serious than a simple disagreement about dress codes. The Veterans Day ceremony that had concluded peacefully was being overshadowed by a conflict that threatened to become a significant incident. Alex Rodriguez found himself studying Sarah's response to increasing pressure, noting how her stillness and composure contrasted sharply with Thompson's growing agitation. His military training had emphasized the importance of maintaining control under pressure, and the woman's behavior suggested discipline that came from experience with situations far more dangerous than campus police confrontations. Dean Hayes reached the outer edge of the crowd and began working his way toward the confrontation, his concern mounting as he observed Thompson's escalating demands and aggressive posture. His experience with both military personnel and law enforcement had taught him to recognize when situations were developing beyond the participants' ability to control them effectively. "I'm not going to remove anything based on assumptions and incomplete understanding of regulations," Sarah replied, her voice carrying quiet authority that contrasted sharply with Thompson's increasing volume. "If you want to pursue this further, I suggest you contact my supervisor or college administration, rather than making public accusations you may not be able to support." Her response was professionally appropriate, but carried undertones that suggested she wasn't intimidated by his threats. Thompson's frustration with what he perceived as continued evasiveness fueled his determination to assert his authority publicly. "Ma'am, I am college administration in my capacity as a law enforcement officer, and I'm directing you to comply with my lawful orders regarding unauthorized military clothing. Your refusal to cooperate is only making this situation worse for yourself." His escalation reflected both his inexperience with complex situations and his need to vindicate his initial challenge publicly. The confrontation had reached a point where resolution would require one party to back down significantly, or new information to emerge that would change the dynamic completely. Thompson's public challenge had committed him to a course of action that would be difficult to retreat from without losing face, while Sarah's calm resistance suggested she had resources and knowledge that she hadn't yet revealed. The stage was set for revelations that would transform the conflict entirely. The atmosphere around the memorial garden had transformed from celebratory to charged with tension as more spectators gathered to witness the unfolding confrontation. Cell phones emerged from pockets and purses as students and community members began recording what they sensed might become a significant incident. The Veterans Day ceremony that had concluded with dignity and respect was being overshadowed by a conflict that threatened to escalate beyond anyone's ability to control it peacefully. Thompson's determination to press his challenge publicly reflected his belief that military traditions required vigorous defense against any perceived violations. His research into uniform regulations had convinced him that his position was legally and morally unassailable, and the growing audience reinforced his sense that this was an important moment to demonstrate his commitment to upholding military standards. The woman's continued resistance to his reasonable requests only confirmed his suspicion that she was attempting to deceive people about her military credentials. Sarah's assessment of the situation included not just Thompson's increasingly aggressive demands, but the positioning and reactions of everyone around them. Her peripheral vision tracked Maria's approach through the crowd, Professor Carter's movement from another direction, and the ROTC cadets' professional interest in the developing conflict. Most significantly, she noted Dean Hayes' approach with the bearing and concern of someone whose military experience had taught him to recognize potential disasters before they became irreversible. The crowd had grown to include representatives from every segment of the college community. Faculty members stood alongside students, local business representatives mixed with veterans and their families, and campus staff found themselves witnesses to a confrontation that was becoming more serious with each exchange. The peaceful atmosphere of the Veterans Day ceremony was being replaced by tension that reflected broader social divisions about military service, civilian understanding, and respect for those who'd served. Alex Rodriguez found himself analyzing the tactical elements of the confrontation with the professional interest of someone training for military leadership. Thompson's positioning was aggressive but poorly considered, blocking his own retreat routes while creating maximum public exposure for whatever outcome emerged. The woman's stance and positioning suggested defensive readiness, combined with situational awareness that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. Her responses indicated training and experience that went significantly beyond civilian security. Work. Professor Carter's military background had taught her to recognize the difference between someone posturing about military service and someone who'd actually served with distinction. Sarah's responses to increasing pressure demonstrated the kind of emotional control and tactical thinking that came from genuine military experience, particularly experience under fire. Carter's growing concern was that Thompson was about to make accusations he would later regret against someone who had legitimately earned whatever respect he was challenging. Maria Santos reached the inner circle of observers and positioned herself where she could intervene if the situation escalated to physical confrontation. Her protective instincts towards Sarah were reinforced by her knowledge of her partner's character and competence. In 4 years of working together, Sarah had never demonstrated dishonesty, attention-seeking behavior, or any tendency to make false claims about her background. If she was wearing military clothing, there had to be legitimate authorization that Thompson was too inexperienced to recognize. Dean Hayes navigated through the crowd with growing urgency as he observed Thompson's escalating demands and Sarah's controlled responses. His military experience had taught him to recognize both authentic service members and the signs of situations developing beyond the participants' control. The combination of Thompson's aggressive certainty and the woman's calm resistance suggested a collision between incomplete information and hidden truth that could result in serious embarrassment for everyone involved. The campus police radio traffic had increased as other officers became aware of Thompson's situation and began monitoring the developing incident. Campus security personnel were positioning themselves around the area, though Tom Wilson had not yet arrived to assess the situation involving his employee. The potential for a simple uniform violation to escalate into a significant campus incident was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone except Thompson himself. Thompson's confidence in his position was reinforced by what he interpreted as Sarah's continued evasiveness and refusal to provide simple documentation that would resolve the situation immediately. His training had emphasized the importance of maintaining authority once challenged, and backing down now would undermine his credibility with the campus community he was sworn to protect. The presence of military personnel and veterans in the crowd made it even more important to demonstrate proper respect for military traditions and regulations. Sarah's preparation for whatever would come next involved accessing mental and emotional resources she'd developed during combat deployments, but hadn't needed to use in civilian life. The skills that had once enabled her to function effectively under extreme pressure remained available when circumstances required them, though she preferred to keep those aspects of her background private. Thompson's accusations and demands were forcing her toward revelations she'd spent 4 years avoiding. The positioning of key figures around the confrontation had created multiple pressure points that would influence whatever resolution emerged. Thompson's aggressive stance had committed him to a course of action that would be difficult to retreat from without significant loss of face. Sarah's controlled resistance suggested she had resources and knowledge that hadn't yet been revealed. The growing crowd included people with sufficient military experience to evaluate whatever evidence might be presented. The jacket itself had become the focal point of a conflict that encompassed much larger issues about military service, civilian understanding, and the challenges faced by veterans transitioning to civilian life. Thompson's focus on what he perceived as unauthorized military clothing reflected his theoretical understanding of regulations combined with his inexperience with the complex realities of military service and veteran status. Sarah's attachment to the jacket represented connections to military service that went far beyond simple fashion choices or sentimental value. Students in the crowd found themselves witnessing a confrontation that challenged their assumptions about military service and civilian authority. Many had limited direct experience with military personnel or veterans, and the developing conflict was providing education about military culture and traditions that wasn't available in any classroom. The tension between Thompson's official authority and the woman's quiet confidence was creating questions about different types of legitimacy and respect. Faculty members observing the situation recognized the potential for significant negative publicity if the confrontation escalated improperly. The college's reputation for supporting veterans and maintaining positive community relationships could be damaged if a campus police officer was seen as harassing someone with legitimate military background. Conversely, failure to address actual stolen valor would be equally problematic for the institution's credibility with military families and veterans organizations. Local community members in the crowd included veterans from multiple service branches and conflicts who were evaluating both Thompson's challenge and Sarah's responses based on their own military experience. Their reactions would influence how the broader community perceived whatever resolution emerged from the confrontation. The Veterans Day ceremony had brought together people with deep personal investments in military honor and traditions, making the stakes significantly higher than a simple campus incident. Thompson escalated his demands with increasing volume and authority, determined to force compliance with what he believed were reasonable requests for documentation. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to provide military identification, or remove that jacket immediately. Your continued refusal to cooperate is becoming a matter for campus administration and potentially local law enforcement." His ultimatum was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the legal and moral authority in the situation. Sarah's response remained calm despite the escalating pressure and growing audience. "Officer Thompson, I've explained that I work security for this college and I'm authorized to be here in that capacity. If you want to pursue questions about my background or clothing, I suggest you follow proper procedures through college administration, rather than making public demands based on incomplete information." Her refusal to be intimidated was becoming more apparent to observers who were beginning to question Thompson's approach. The confrontation had reached a critical point where de-escalation would require significant compromise from one or both parties, or new information would need to emerge that would completely change the dynamic. Thompson's public challenge had created expectations among the crowd that some form of resolution would be forthcoming. Sarah's continued resistance suggested she had knowledge or resources that hadn't yet been revealed, but that she was prepared to use if necessary. Professor Carter decided that intervention was necessary to prevent what she recognized as a developing disaster for Thompson and potentially for the college. She began pushing more aggressively through the crowd, hoping to reach the confrontation. Before Thompson made accusations he couldn't support against someone who appeared to have legitimate military background. Her movement attracted attention from other faculty members who recognized her military experience and began following her lead. Alex Rodriguez found himself increasingly concerned about Thompson's approach and tactics. His military training had emphasized the importance of gathering complete intelligence before taking action, and Thompson's demands seemed based on assumptions rather than verified information. The woman's responses suggested she had knowledge and experience that Thompson hadn't considered, and the situation was developing in ways that could result in significant embarrassment for campus law enforcement. Maria Santos positioned herself where she could intervene physically if necessary, though she hoped the situation wouldn't escalate to that point. Her knowledge of Sarah's character and competence made her increasingly protective as Thompson's accusations became more serious. She'd never seen Sarah back down from legitimate challenges to her authority, but she'd also never seen her partner respond to confrontational behavior with anything other than professional competence and emotional control. Dean Hayes reached the inner circle of observers and began assessing the situation with the analytical skills developed through decades of military leadership. His preliminary evaluation suggested that Thompson was operating on incomplete information while the woman demonstrated responses consistent with genuine military experience. The potential for serious embarrassment was becoming obvious to everyone except the campus police officer himself. The crowd's attention had focused completely on the developing confrontation, with conversations stopping and positioning, adjusting as people recognized they were witnessing something significant. The peaceful conclusion of the Veterans Day ceremony was being overshadowed by a conflict that was touching on fundamental questions about military service, respect, and civilian understanding of military culture and traditions. Thompson's frustration with Sarah's continued resistance fueled his determination to assert his authority decisively. "Ma'am, your refusal to comply with reasonable requests for documentation is creating a public disturbance and potentially violating federal laws regarding stolen valor. I'm directing you to remove that jacket immediately and provide identification, or this situation will escalate to formal charges." His threat represented a significant escalation that would be difficult to retreat from regardless of whatever information might subsequently emerge. Sarah's assessment of the situation included recognition that Thompson's escalating demands were forcing her toward choices she'd hoped to avoid. Her options were narrowing to compliance with unreasonable demands, public humiliation, or revelation of information she'd kept private for 4 years. The growing crowd and increasing pressure were creating circumstances that would make continued anonymity impossible regardless of how she responded to Thompson's ultimatum. The positioning of authority figures around the confrontation created multiple potential intervention points, but none of the observers had yet chosen to insert themselves directly into the conflict. Professor Carter was still pushing through the crowd. Dean Hayes was assessing the situation from the periphery, and Tom Wilson remained unaware that his employee was facing serious accusations from campus police. The momentum of the confrontation was building toward a resolution that would be determined by the two primary participants. Thompson's confidence in his legal and moral position was absolute, reinforced by his research into relevant regulations and his belief that military traditions required vigorous defense against any perceived violations. His determination to force compliance publicly reflected his conviction that backing down would undermine both his authority and his respect for military service. The woman's continued resistance only confirmed his suspicion that she was attempting to deceive people about her military credentials. Sarah's preparation for whatever revelation might be necessary involved accessing memories and experiences she'd worked hard to keep compartmentalized. The proof of her military service was written in scars and records that she'd hidden from civilian scrutiny. But Thompson's escalating accusations were making continued concealment impossible. Her decision about how much to reveal would be influenced by the specific nature of his demands and the composition of the audience witnessing their confrontation. The crowd had grown large enough that campus security was beginning to monitor the situation for potential crowd control issues. The Veterans Day ceremony had concluded peacefully, but the aftermath was developing into a significant incident that could require administrative intervention. Students were recording the confrontation on their phones, ensuring that whatever resolution emerged would be preserved and potentially shared beyond the immediate campus community. Faculty members in the crowd were becoming increasingly concerned about the potential negative publicity if a campus police officer was seen as inappropriately harassing someone with legitimate military background. The college's reputation for supporting veterans and maintaining positive community relationships could be significantly damaged if the confrontation escalated improperly. Conversely, failure to address actual stolen valor would be equally problematic for institutional credibility. With military families and veterans organizations, local veterans observing the confrontation were evaluating both Thompson's challenge and Sarah's responses based on their own military experience and knowledge of military culture. Their reactions would influence how the broader community perceived whatever resolution emerged, making the stakes significantly higher than a simple campus disciplinary matter. The Veterans Day ceremony had brought together people with deep personal investments in military honor, making the accusations particularly sensitive. Thompson delivered his final ultimatum with the authority of someone who believed he held all the legal and moral power in the situation. "Ma'am, I'm giving you a direct order to remove that jacket and provide military identification immediately. Your continued refusal constitutes insubordination and potentially criminal behavior. This is your last opportunity to comply voluntarily before I take formal action." His demand represented the maximum pressure he could apply short of physical enforcement. Sarah's response would determine whether the confrontation escalated to physical conflict, administrative intervention, or revelation of information that would completely change everyone's understanding of the situation. Her options had narrowed to compliance with unreasonable demands, submission to public humiliation, or disclosure of military service that she'd kept hidden for 4 years. The choice she made would affect not only her own future, but Thompson's career and the college's relationship with its military community. The moment of maximum pressure had arrived, with Thompson committed to a course of action he couldn't retreat from without significant loss of face, and Sarah forced to choose between continued concealment and revelation of military service that would transform how everyone present understood both her background and Thompson's accusations. The Veterans Day ceremony that had concluded with honor and dignity was about to become the setting for revelations that would challenge everyone's assumptions about service, sacrifice, and the hidden burdens carried by those who'd served their country in ways that couldn't be easily explained or understood. Professor Carter finally reached the inner circle of observers and prepared to intervene before Thompson made accusations he would later regret. Her military experience had convinced her that the woman demonstrated authentic service background, and she was increasingly concerned the campus police officer was about to embarrass both himself and the institution. Her intervention would need to be carefully calculated to de-escalate the situation without undermining Thompson's authority completely. Dean Hayes moved closer to the confrontation with growing urgency as he recognized the potential for serious institutional consequences regardless of how the situation resolved. His assessment suggested that Thompson was operating on incomplete information while challenging someone who appeared to have legitimate military credentials. The potential for embarrassment was becoming obvious to everyone except the participants themselves. Sarah looked directly at Thompson with the steady gaze of someone who'd made difficult decisions under pressure before. Her response would either end the confrontation through compliance or escalation, or it would reveal information that would completely transform everyone's understanding of who she was and what she'd earned the right to wear. The choice was hers, but the consequences would affect everyone present. Thompson waited for her response with absolute confidence in his position and complete ignorance of the storm he was about to unleash. His determination to uphold military traditions was genuine, but his understanding of those traditions was incomplete. The woman he was challenging had earned rights he'd never dreamed of claiming, and the proof of her service was about to be revealed in ways that would challenge everything he thought he knew about military service and sacrifice. The crowd held its collective breath As Sarah reached for the zipper of her father's field jacket, her movements deliberate and controlled. What happened next would either vindicate Thompson's challenge or expose him to embarrassment that would follow him for the rest of his career. The Veterans Day ceremony was about to become the setting for revelations that would change everything. Sarah's fingers found the zipper of her father's field jacket with steady precision, her movements deliberate despite the weight of dozens of eyes watching her every action. The crowd had grown silent, sensing that whatever was about to unfold would be significant beyond a simple uniform dispute. Thompson stood rigid with anticipation, certain that his challenge would be vindicated. When she complied with his demands to remove what he believed was unauthorized military clothing, the jacket slipped from Sarah's shoulders with practiced ease, revealing a simple green cotton shirt underneath that offered no immediate clues about her background or credentials. Thompson's confidence flickered momentarily as he realized the jacket's removal hadn't produced the dramatic confession or embarrassment he'd expected. The crowd leaned forward slightly, sensing that the confrontation was entering a new phase that none of them had anticipated. Without breaking eye contact with Thompson, Sarah began rolling up her right sleeve with methodical precision. Her movements were unhurried and deliberate, as if she was revealing something sacred that had been protected for years. The fabric moved upward slowly, exposing skin that bore witness to experiences Thompson couldn't imagine and service he'd never understand. The first thing visible was scar tissue, pale lines against tan skin that spoke of wounds earned in circumstances far removed from college campuses and routine security work. But as more of her forearm became visible, gasps began rippling through the crowd as they saw what had been hidden beneath the long sleeve she always wore. There, etched in bold black ink against her skin, was a Ranger tab, not an amateur tattoo or civilian imitation, but the authentic military insignia that could only be earned through completing one of the most grueling training programs the United States Army offered. The distinctive curved tab bore the single word Ranger in block letters that had been permanently marked into skin that also bore the scars of combat service. But the Ranger tab was only part of what Sarah's rolled sleeve revealed. Below it, in smaller but equally precise lettering, were dates and coordinates that meant nothing to most observers, but everything to those who understood military notation. Afghanistan 2009 to 2012 was inscribed in clean lines, followed by GPS coordinates that marked locations where American soldiers had fought and died in mountains and valleys half a world away. Thompson's face went white as the implications of what he was seeing began to register. The Ranger tab wasn't something that could be faked or purchased at a surplus store. It represented completion of training that broke most candidates, graduation from programs that demanded physical and mental toughness beyond normal human limits. Only soldiers who'd proven themselves capable of operating behind enemy lines, conducting raids in hostile territory, and leading other elite troops earned the right to wear the Ranger tab. The silence stretched as more people in the crowd began to understand what they were witnessing. Alex Rodriguez, with his ROTC training, was among the first to grasp the significance of what Sarah had revealed. Rangers were the elite of the elite, soldiers selected from the best units in the Army and subjected to training that eliminated all but the most exceptional candidates. The woman Thompson had accused of stolen valor was revealing credentials that surpassed anything he'd ever dreamed of earning. Professor Carter pushed through the final layer of observers and reached the inner circle just as the full implications of Sarah's revelation became apparent. Her Navy background had taught her to respect the different specialties and elite units of other service branches, and Rangers held a particular place of honor in military culture. They were the soldiers other soldiers looked up to, the ones who volunteered for the most dangerous missions and succeeded where others failed. Dean Hayes felt his stomach drop as he recognized both the Ranger tab and the combat deployment dates on Sarah's arm. His own military service had brought him into contact with Rangers during joint operations, and he knew the kind of soldiers who earned that designation. They were professionals who operated in small teams behind enemy lines, conducting missions that officially never happened and carrying burdens that civilian society couldn't understand. Maria Santos stared at her partner's revealed tattoo with a mixture of awe and sudden understanding. 4 years of working together had shown her Sarah's exceptional competence and leadership abilities, but she'd never imagined the depth of military experience that had shaped those qualities. The mysterious knowledge, the tactical thinking, and the unflappable composure under pressure suddenly made perfect sense in light of what was written on Sarah's arm. But Sarah wasn't finished with her revelation. Below the Ranger tab in deployment information, in smaller script that required closer examination to read clearly, were 7 names. They were arranged in 2 columns with military precision, each name followed by dates that marked both birth and death. These weren't random names or memorial tributes, but something far more personal and painful. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, January 15, 1988 to March 22, 2012. Sarah read aloud, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, December 3, 1985 to March 22, 2012. Specialist David Kim, August 19, 1991 to March 22, 2012. Her recitation continued through all 7 names, each one representing a life lost under her command in circumstances that had shaped every day of her civilian existence. The crowd had become completely silent as they realized they were witnessing something beyond a simple dispute about military clothing. This was a woman bearing witness to fallen comrades, honoring soldiers who died in combat under circumstances that clearly continued to affect her years later. The March 22, 2012 date appeared after each name, marking a single day when 7 American soldiers had made the ultimate sacrifice. Thompson found himself unable to speak as the magnitude of his mistake became apparent. He'd challenged the military credentials of someone whose service record surpassed anything in his understanding of military excellence. Rangers were legendary figures in military culture, soldiers who volunteered for the most dangerous missions and succeeded where conventional forces couldn't operate. The woman he'd accused of stolen valor had earned distinctions he'd never even dreamed of pursuing. Dean Hayes stepped forward with the measured pace of someone whose military experience had taught him to recognize both exceptional service and profound loss. Sergeant Mitchell, he said formally, using the rank that her Ranger tab had earned her, would you tell us about March 22, 2012? His question was delivered with the respect due to someone whose combat service deserved recognition rather than interrogation. Sarah's response came after a long pause, as if she was accessing memories that she'd worked hard to keep compartmentalized. We were conducting a reconnaissance mission in the Kunar province. Intelligence had identified a high-value target in a compound that conventional forces couldn't approach without significant civilian casualties. Our team was tasked with gathering information and, if possible, eliminating the threat. Her voice remained steady as she continued, but those who knew how to listen for such things could hear the careful control that kept emotion from overwhelming her account. The mission was supposed to be routine surveillance, but intelligence was incomplete. What we found was a much larger enemy force than expected, and they were waiting for us. Professor Carter found herself holding her breath as Sarah continued her account. Military operations that resulted in entire teams being lost were rare and typically resulted from extraordinary circumstances or catastrophic intelligence failures. The fact that Sarah had survived when 7 others died suggested a level of heroism that went far beyond normal military service. The compound was heavily fortified and contained approximately 30 enemy fighters, rather than the 5 or 6 we'd been briefed about. Sarah continued, her clinical delivery making the words even more powerful. When we were discovered, they had us pinned down with no clear extraction route. My team leader was killed in the first exchange of fire, leaving me in command of 6 soldiers in an impossible tactical situation. Alex Rodriguez found himself analyzing Sarah's account with the tactical knowledge his ROTC training had provided, trying to understand the military situation she was describing. A 7-person ranger team facing 30 enemy fighters and fortified positions represented odds that no amount of training could overcome through conventional tactics. Survival would require extraordinary leadership and sacrifice that went beyond normal expectations of military service. The crowd had grown larger as word of the confrontation and subsequent revelation spread across campus. Students, faculty, and community members who'd missed the initial Veterans Day ceremony were arriving to witness what had become a profound moment of military recognition and remembrance. Cell phone cameras continued recording, but the atmosphere had shifted from conflict to commemoration. The enemy had superior numbers and defensive positions. Sarah continued, her recitation taking on the formal tone of an after-action report. Standard extraction procedures were impossible due to their overlapping fields of fire. I made the decision to create a diversion that would allow the wounded members of my team to reach the extraction point while I provided cover fire. Tom Wilson arrived at the outer edge of the crowd just as Sarah was describing the tactical situation that had resulted in her teammates' deaths. As her supervisor, he'd worked with her for 4 years without understanding the depth of military experience that had shaped her approach to security work. The revelation that his most reliable employee was a decorated combat veteran forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about her background and qualifications. Dean Hayes nodded with the understanding of someone whose own military experience had involved similar, impossible choices between personal survival and mission accomplishment. Rangers were trained to complete their missions regardless of personal cost, and Sarah's account suggested she'd faced the kind of tactical situation that required sacrificing personal safety for team survival. I was able to suppress enemy fire long enough for the wounded to reach the landing zone. Sarah continued, her voice betraying no emotion despite the magnitude of what she was describing. But the extraction helicopter came under heavy fire and was forced to abort the mission. My team was trapped in the compound with no support available for 6 hours. The tactical situation Sarah was describing represented every soldier's nightmare, a combat scenario where training and equipment weren't sufficient to overcome overwhelming enemy advantages. Rangers were elite soldiers, but they were still human beings facing situations that could overwhelm even the most exceptional training and leadership. Maria Santos found herself seeing her partner in an entirely new light as she listened to Sarah's account of combat leadership under impossible circumstances. The quiet competence and unflappable composure that had made Sarah such an effective security partner suddenly made sense when understood as qualities developed through command responsibility in life or death situations. During those 6 hours, I lost all 7 members of my team, Sarah said quietly, her voice finally showing the emotional weight that she'd carried for over a decade. They died because I couldn't find a way to get them home safely. They died following my orders in a situation where there were no good choices available. The crowd's reaction to Sarah's revelation was a mixture of awe, respect, and profound sadness for the loss she'd experienced and continued to carry. Veterans in the audience understood the survivor's guilt that shaped her words, while civilians began to grasp the magnitude of sacrifice that military service could demand from those who served. Thompson found himself faced with a situation that his training had never prepared him for. He'd challenged the military credentials of someone whose service record included distinctions he'd never imagined and losses he couldn't comprehend. His accusations of stolen valor had targeted someone who'd earned the right to wear military insignia through combat service that surpassed anything in his understanding of military excellence. Professor Carter stepped forward with the authority. of someone whose own military service gave her standing to address the situation appropriately. Sergeant Mitchell, your service record speaks for itself. The Ranger tab represents achievements that deserve recognition, not interrogation. Your team's sacrifice honors the best traditions of military service. Dean Hayes moved closer to the center of the confrontation, his bearing reflecting both his military background and his administrative responsibility for campus climate. Sergeant Mitchell, this college owes you an apology for the circumstances that forced you to reveal service that should have been recognized and honored rather than questioned. Sarah's response came after a long pause, as if she was considering how much more of her story needed to be told. I left active duty after that mission because I couldn't continue leading soldiers when I'd failed to bring my team home. The Ranger tab represents what I once was, not who I am now. I work security because it lets me serve without having to explain why 7 better soldiers didn't come home when I did. The emotional weight of Sarah's explanation affected everyone present differently. Veterans understood the survivor's guilt that had shaped her post-military career choices, while civilians began to grasp why someone with her qualifications would choose anonymity over recognition. The tragedy of her combat experience provided context for years of deliberate invisibility. Alex Rodriguez found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about military service and leadership as he listened to Sarah's account. ROTC training had emphasized tactical excellence and mission accomplishment, but Sarah's story illustrated the personal cost of command decisions made under impossible circumstances. Her survival represented both professional success and personal tragedy that would shape the rest of her life. Thompson's attempts to formulate an apology were complicated by his growing understanding of how completely he'd misunderstood the situation. He'd challenged someone whose military service included distinctions he'd never heard of and sacrifices he couldn't comprehend. His accusations had forced revelations that Sarah had clearly preferred to keep private, adding to burdens she'd carried for over a decade. Sergeant Mitchell, Thompson finally managed, his voice reflecting genuine remorse and newfound respect. I owe you an apology that goes far beyond words. I challenged your right to wear military clothing without understanding what you'd earned or sacrificed to earn it. Your service record humbles anything I thought I knew about military excellence. Sarah's response was delivered with the same steady composure she'd maintained throughout the confrontation, despite the emotional weight of memories she'd been forced to revisit. Officer Thompson, you were doing what you thought was right. Military traditions deserve protection, and questioning unauthorized use of military symbols is appropriate. You couldn't have known my background because I chose to keep it private. The crowd began to disperse slowly as the immediate tension of the confrontation resolved into something more reflective and commemorative. Students and faculty members who'd witnessed Sarah's revelation carried with them new understanding of military service and the hidden burdens carried by veterans in their community. The Veterans Day ceremony had concluded with recognition of service that went far beyond anything they'd expected to witness. Professor Carter approached Sarah with the respect due to someone whose military service commanded recognition from all branches of the armed forces. Sergeant Mitchell, if you're ever willing to share your experiences with students or faculty, the Military History Department would be honored to provide that opportunity. Your service represents the kind of leadership and sacrifice that deserves academic recognition. Dean Hayes extended an invitation that reflected both his personal respect for Sarah's service and his institutional commitment to supporting veterans. Sergeant Mitchell, this college has programs designed to support veterans in transition, and your experiences could help other veterans who are struggling with similar challenges. Your leadership and service record suggest you have much to offer. Students and fellow veterans. Maria Santos approached her partner with newfound understanding of the experiences that had shaped Sarah's approach to security work and civilian life. Sarah, I've worked with you for 4 years without knowing what you'd been through. Your service explains so much about your competence and leadership. I'm honored to have learned from you, even when I didn't understand what I was learning. Tom Wilson's conversation with Sarah would need to address not only her revealed military background, but also how that information would affect her role within campus security. Her Ranger training and combat experience represented qualifications that far exceeded anything required for security work, raising questions about career goals and institutional opportunities that hadn't previously been considered. Alex Rodriguez approached Sarah with the respect of someone whose military training had taught him to recognize exceptional service when he encountered it. "Ma'am, my ROTC training included studying Ranger operations and leadership principles. Meeting someone who actually earned the Ranger tab and led soldiers in combat is an honor I didn't expect. Thank you for your service and sacrifice." The memorial garden where the confrontation had taken place took on new significance as the site where hidden military service had been revealed and honored rather than challenged. The names on the existing memorial were joined in spirit by the 7 names tattooed on Sarah's arm, representing sacrifice that connected past and present service members in bonds that civilian society rarely understood. Sarah's decision about how to move forward would be influenced by the changed circumstances resulting from her forced revelation. 4 years of deliberate anonymity had ended with public recognition of military service that she'd preferred to keep private. The quiet life she'd built would need to accommodate new relationships and expectations based on her revealed background. The college administration would need to consider how Sarah's revealed military background affected her role within campus security and the institution's relationships with veteran students and community organizations. Her Ranger training and combat leadership experience represented resources that could benefit the college's veteran support programs if she chose to participate in such activities. The broader campus community would remember the Veterans Day ceremony not for the official program, but for the moment when hidden military service was revealed and honored. Sarah's story would become part of campus culture, influencing how students and faculty understood military service and the veterans who chose to serve in civilian roles after their military careers ended. Thompson's career would be affected by his role in forcing Sarah's revelation, though the outcome depended largely on how he responded to his newfound understanding of her background and service. His challenge had been based on incomplete information, but his willingness to learn from the experience would determine whether the incident enhanced or hindered his professional development. The 7 names tattooed on Sarah's arm would no longer be private memorials known only to her, but part of a public record of service and sacrifice that honored fallen soldiers through community recognition. Their story had been told not through official channels, but through the revelation of one survivor's continued commitment to their memory. Years later, Sarah would look back on this Veterans Day as the moment when her carefully constructed anonymity ended and her true service began. The confrontation that had forced her to reveal hidden military credentials also opened opportunities to honor her fallen teammates and serve her community in ways that her security work alone couldn't accomplish. The Ranger tab that had been hidden beneath long sleeves for 4 years became a symbol not just of individual achievement, but of service that connected military and civilian communities in bonds of mutual respect and understanding. Sarah's story reminded everyone present that the most important service often remained invisible until circumstances forced recognition of sacrifice that deserved honor rather than interrogation. The weeks following the Veterans Day revelation transformed Sarah's existence at Riverside Community College in ways she'd never anticipated. Word of the confrontation and her subsequent disclosure spread through the campus and surrounding community with the speed that only genuine human drama could achieve. Students who'd never noticed the quiet security guard began approaching her with questions about military service, while faculty members found excuses to engage her in conversations about veteran experiences and campus security improvements. Dean Hayes had scheduled a private meeting with Sarah 3 days after the incident, ostensibly to discuss her role within the college community, but actually to gauge her willingness to participate in veteran support programs that could benefit from her unique background and experiences. His office, decorated with military memorabilia from his own service, provided a neutral setting where they could discuss her future without the pressure of public attention that had followed her revelation. "Sergeant Mitchell," Hayes began, using the rank that her Ranger tab had established as appropriate, "I want to discuss opportunities that might interest you. But first, I need to understand your comfort level with increased visibility. The incident with Officer Thompson has made your military background public knowledge, and that creates both opportunities and obligations that you didn't choose." Sarah's response reflected the careful consideration she'd given to her changed circumstances during sleepless nights spent reconsidering 4 years of deliberate anonymity. "Dean Hayes, I've spent 4 years trying to serve quietly without drawing attention to experiences I wasn't ready to discuss. The confrontation forced me to reveal information I'd kept private, but it also reminded me that my teammates' sacrifice deserves recognition rather than concealment." The conversation that followed explored possibilities that ranged from guest lectures in military history classes to formal involvement in veteran student support services. Hayes had researched Sarah's military records within the limits of what remained classified and discovered commendations and achievements that suggested leadership capabilities far beyond anything her security position had required. Her Bronze Star with Valor device, Purple Heart, and Combat Medical Badge represented a combination of courage, sacrifice, and technical competence that could benefit the college community in numerous ways. Professor Carter had become one of Sarah's most persistent advocates for increased involvement in academic programs. Her own Navy background provided insight into the challenges veterans faced when transitioning to civilian careers, and she recognized Sarah's potential to serve as both educator and mentor for students pursuing military careers or struggling to understand military culture. The Military History Department had developed several programs designed to bridge the gap between academic study and practical military experience, but they lacked instructors with recent combat experience who could provide first-hand perspective on modern military operations. "Sarah," Carter said during one of their conversations in the faculty lounge, "students today are learning about military operations from textbooks written by people who've never been shot at. Your experiences in Afghanistan could provide context and reality that no academic study can match. You've commanded soldiers in combat, made life or death decisions under impossible circumstances, and dealt with the consequences of leadership in ways that our students need to understand." The invitation to speak at military history seminars represented a significant departure from the anonymity Sarah had cultivated, but it also offered opportunities to honor her fallen teammates in ways that her security work couldn't accomplish. Her initial reluctance gave way to recognition that education about military service could prevent future misunderstandings like the one that had forced her revelation. Alex Rodriguez had become an unexpected bridge between Sarah's military experience and the college's ROTC program. His respect for her Ranger credentials had developed into genuine mentorship as he prepared for his own military career after graduation. Their conversations about leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the realities of combat command provided education that no classroom instruction could replicate. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said during one of their discussions about tactical decision-making, "my instructors teach us about leadership principles and military doctrine, but they can't explain what it feels like to make decisions when people's lives depend on your judgment. Your willingness to share those experiences is helping me understand responsibilities I'll face as an officer." Sarah's growing involvement with ROTC activities reflected her recognition that her combat experience could benefit young people preparing for military service in ways that her security work alone couldn't accomplish. Her approach to mentorship emphasized practical application of military principles rather than theoretical knowledge, drawing on experiences that had shaped her understanding of leadership under extreme pressure. Maria Santos had adjusted to her partner's revealed background with characteristic pragmatism, though she found herself reassessing 4 years of interactions in light of Sarah's military credentials. The exceptional competence and leadership abilities that had made Sarah such an effective security partner now made perfect sense when understood as qualities developed through Ranger training and combat command experience. Sarah, Maria said, during one of their routine patrols, "I always wondered why you seemed to know things that weren't in any security manual. Now I understand that you were applying military training to civilian situations in ways that made our job easier without me realizing what you were doing." Their working relationship had evolved to include discussions about tactical approaches to campus security that drew on Sarah's military background while maintaining the low-profile approach that civilian security required. Maria found herself learning principles of situational awareness, threat assessment, and crisis management that enhanced her own professional capabilities. Tom Wilson's supervision of Sarah had become more collaborative as he recognized the depth of experience she brought to campus security operations. Her military background explained years of exceptional performance and provided opportunities for improving security protocols that he'd never considered. Her insights into emergency response planning, crowd control, and threat assessment reflected training and experience that surpassed anything available through civilian security programs. "Sarah," Wilson said during a security planning meeting, "your military background gives you perspective on security issues that I need to incorporate into our campus-wide protocols. Your Ranger training included scenarios and solutions that could improve our response to various emergency situations." The enhanced security measures they developed together drew on military principles adapted for civilian applications, creating protocols that improved campus safety without creating the militaristic atmosphere that would be inappropriate for an educational environment. Sarah's ability to translate military tactics into civilian security applications provided benefits that extended far beyond her individual performance. Thompson's relationship with Sarah had evolved from antagonistic challenge to respectful recognition, though their interactions remained somewhat awkward as he continued processing the magnitude of his initial mistake. His research into Ranger qualifications and combat records had provided education about military service that his previous theoretical knowledge had lacked. "Sergeant Mitchell," Thompson said during one of their professional interactions, "I've been studying Ranger operations and leadership principles since our confrontation. Your willingness to forgive my ignorance and help me understand what I should have recognized initially has taught me more about military service than any manual or regulation." His growth from the experience had transformed his approach to campus policing, emphasizing investigation and understanding over immediate enforcement of regulations he might not fully comprehend. Sarah's example had demonstrated the importance of recognizing that appearances could be deceiving and that assumptions based on incomplete information could lead to serious errors in judgment. The college's veteran student population had responded to Sarah's revelation with a mixture of respect and relief at having someone on campus who understood their experiences and challenges. Many had struggled with the transition from military to academic life, and Sarah's presence provided both formal and informal support that helped them navigate civilian educational environments. "Sergeant Mitchell," said James Patterson, a Marine veteran pursuing his business degree, "having someone on campus who understands what we've been through makes a huge difference. You know why we sometimes react differently to stress, why crowds can be overwhelming, and why authority relationships can be complicated for people who've commanded others in combat." Sarah's informal counseling and mentorship of veteran students had developed naturally from her security interactions, but her revealed background gave her advice additional credibility and effectiveness. her own struggles with civilian transition, provided insight into challenges that academic advisors without military experience couldn't fully understand or address. The memorial garden where her confrontation with Thompson had taken place had been expanded to include a dedicated section, honoring the 7 Rangers whose names were tattooed on Sarah's arm. The addition was modest but meaningful, consisting of a small granite marker bearing their names and the simple inscription, "They answered when called," beneath the dates of their birth and death. Sarah's participation in the dedication ceremony represented her first public acknowledgement of her teammates' sacrifice and her role in preserving their memory. Her brief remarks focused on their service rather than her survival, emphasizing their commitment to mission accomplishment and care for fellow soldiers that had defined their character. Michael Torres, Jennifer Walsh, David Kim, Robert Johnson, Stephen Martinez, Lisa Chun, and Christopher Williams died because they refused to abandon wounded comrades and incomplete missions. Sarah said to the assembled crowd, "Their sacrifice represents the best traditions of military service, and their memory deserves recognition that extends beyond my personal grief." The ceremony attracted veterans from throughout the region, many of whom had served in Afghanistan during the same time period and understood the tactical situations that had resulted in the loss of Sarah's team. Their presence provided community recognition of sacrifice that had previously been known only to Sarah and the families of the fallen Rangers. Local media coverage of the memorial dedication and Sarah's story had spread beyond the immediate campus community, attracting attention from veteran organizations, military historians, and television producers interested in featuring her experiences. Sarah's response to media requests reflected her continued preference for privacy, while acknowledging her responsibility to honor her teammates' memory through public recognition of their service. "I'll participate in activities that honor my teammates and educate people about military service," Sarah told reporters. "But I'm not interested in personal publicity or celebrity status. Their story deserves to be told, but my survival doesn't make me a hero." Her measured approach to media attention balanced public education about military service with protection of privacy, regarding experiences that remained painful despite the passage of time. The distinction between honoring fallen comrades and exploiting personal tragedy guided her decisions about which opportunities to accept and which to decline. The college's annual Veterans Day ceremony the following year was transformed by Sarah's presence and participation. Her role as keynote speaker represented full integration of her military background into her civilian identity, allowing her to serve both her fallen teammates' memory and her current community's educational needs. Military service requires ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things under circumstances that test every aspect of human character, Sarah told the assembled crowd. "The men and women we honor today answered that call, and their service created opportunities and freedoms that we celebrate not just on Veterans Day, but every day we live in safety and freedom." Her speech drew connections between military service and civilian responsibilities, emphasizing that honoring veterans required more than annual ceremonies or symbolic gestures. The education, employment, and healthcare needs of veterans demanded ongoing community commitment that extended far beyond patriotic holidays. The scholarship fund established in honor of Sarah's fallen teammates had grown to provide substantial assistance to veteran students pursuing degrees at Riverside Community College. The fund's criteria emphasized academic achievement combined with community service, reflecting the values that had characterized the Rangers whose sacrifice it commemorated. "This scholarship honors soldiers who died serving others," Sarah explained to donors and recipients, "and it should support students who demonstrate similar commitment to service that extends beyond personal benefit." The recipients each year included both veteran students and civilian students pursuing careers in public service, creating a diverse group united by commitment to serving others rather than simply advancing their own interests. Sarah's expanded Role within the college community had evolved to include formal responsibilities that utilized her military background while supporting institutional goals. Her appointment as coordinator of veteran student services provided structure for activities that had previously been informal, while her involvement in security planning and emergency response training enhanced campus safety through application of military principles to civilian situations. Sarah brings unique qualifications to veteran support services, Dean Hayes explained to the Board of Trustees. Her combat experience provides credibility with veteran students, while her years in civilian employment demonstrate successful transition that can serve as a model for others. Her office in the Student Services Building became a gathering place for veteran students seeking advice, support, or simply conversation with someone who understood their experiences. The informal mentorship and counseling she provided complemented formal academic advising and career counseling, addressing aspects of veteran transition that academic professionals without military experience couldn't fully understand. The ROTC program's integration of Sarah's expertise had enhanced training effectiveness through addition of realistic scenarios and practical applications that textbook instruction couldn't provide. Her guest lectures on leadership under pressure, tactical decision-making, and combat stress management provided education that prepared cadets for responsibilities they would face as military officers. Sergeant Mitchell's contributions to our program are invaluable, said Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the ROTC commander. Her combat experience and leadership background provide perspective that no classroom instruction can replicate. Our cadets are better prepared for military service because of her willingness to share her experiences. The training exercises and leadership scenarios she developed drew on actual combat situations without revealing classified information, creating educational opportunities that bridge the gap between academic study and practical military application. Thompson's professional development had been significantly influenced by his experience with Sarah and his subsequent education about military service and veteran issues. His approach to campus policing had evolved to emphasize understanding and investigation over immediate enforcement, reflecting recognition that appearances could be deceiving and assumptions dangerous. That confrontation taught me more about law enforcement than any training course, Thompson admitted during a performance review. I learned to investigate before making accusations, to consider perspectives I might not immediately understand, and to recognize that people's backgrounds can be far more complex than their current roles suggest. His growth from the experience had enhanced his effectiveness as a campus police officer while providing personal education about military service and veteran transition that influenced his interactions with all community members. The annual memorial run that had been established to honor Sarah's fallen teammates had become a significant campus tradition that attracted participants from throughout the region. The 7-mile course ended at the Memorial Garden, where participants paid respects to the fallen Rangers and learned about their service and sacrifice. This run honors soldiers who gave everything for their mission and their teammates, Sarah explained to participants each year. Completing these 7 miles reminds us that their sacrifice created opportunities we should use wisely and freedoms we should protect carefully. The event had grown to include educational components about military service, veteran issues, and community support for those who'd served. Local businesses sponsored the event while veteran organizations provided information about services and support available to veterans and their families. Sarah's transformation from anonymous security guard to recognized veteran leader had required adjustments that extended beyond her professional responsibilities to encompass personal relationships and community involvement. The privacy she'd valued for 4 years had been replaced by visibility that carried both opportunities and obligations she continued to navigate carefully. I've had to learn that honoring my teammates' memory sometimes requires accepting recognition I don't want, Sarah reflected during a conversation with Professor Carter. Their sacrifice deserves community acknowledgement, and my survival gives me responsibility to ensure their story is told properly. Her approach to increased visibility balanced public education about military service with protection of personal privacy regarding experiences that remained difficult to discuss. The distinction between honoring fallen comrades and exploiting personal trauma guided her decisions about community involvement and public appearances. The impact of Sarah's revelation had extended far beyond the immediate campus community to influence regional understanding of military service and veteran transition. Her story had been featured in veteran publications, military history journals, and educational programs designed to bridge the gap between civilian and military communities. Sarah's experience illustrates both the challenges veterans face in civilian transition and the resources they bring to community service, wrote a military historian who'd studied her case. Her story demonstrates that the most valuable veterans are often those who serve quietly without seeking recognition for their military achievements. The broader recognition had created opportunities for Sarah to influence veteran policy and support programs at state and national levels, though she remained selective about activities that took time away from her local responsibilities and community commitments. Years after the Veterans Day confrontation that had transformed her life, Sarah continued working at Riverside Community College with expanded responsibilities that honored both her military background and her commitment to education and community service. The anonymous security guard had become a recognized leader whose influence extended far beyond campus boundaries while remaining grounded in daily service to students, faculty, and community members. The 7 names tattooed on her arm remained visible reminders of the soldiers whose sacrifice had shaped her civilian life and continued to guide her choices about service and recognition. Their memory lived on not only in personal grief but in community education, veteran support, and leadership development that honored their commitment to serving others. The Ranger tab that had been hidden for 4 years had become a symbol of service that connected military and civilian communities in mutual respect and understanding. Sarah's story reminded everyone who encountered it that the most important service often remained invisible until circumstances revealed sacrifice that deserved honor rather than scrutiny. Her legacy at Riverside Community College would endure long after her eventual retirement, embedded in veteran support programs, security protocols, educational curricula, and community traditions that reflected military values adapted for civilian service. The confrontation that had threatened her anonymity had ultimately enabled service that honored her fallen teammates while benefiting countless others who would never know their names but would benefit from their sacrifice. The transformation from hidden veteran to community leader had required courage different from, but related to the bravery that had earned her Ranger tab and combat decorations. The willingness to serve publicly while carrying private grief represented a different kind of heroism that honored the past while building the future. As Sarah looked ahead to continued service at Riverside Community College, she carried with her the knowledge that her teammates' sacrifice had meaning that extended far beyond the mountains of Afghanistan where they died. Their memory lived on in every student who learned from her experience, every veteran who found support through programs she'd developed, and every community member who gained understanding of military service through her example. The woman who'd once hidden her Ranger tab beneath long sleeves had learned that some service required visibility rather than anonymity, and that honoring fallen comrades sometimes meant accepting recognition she'd never sought. Her story continued, not as a tale of individual heroism, but as an example of how military values could enhance civilian communities when veterans found ways to serve that honored both their past sacrifice and their present opportunities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.